So now we're on for shapes and shading to complex shapes. Last time we went over uh, basic shapes such as circles, squares, and it kind of had to break down objects into simple objects into more simple shapes. And then the homework was to do two to three of those objects and shade a couple of them with some of the drawing shapes we were using. So now that we've done a couple of those, we can start stacking shapes to make more complex objects. And you'll see that I have an image of the face, which is, this is called a face turnaround. So a turnaround is when you have something that perfectly lines up and you get to see it from all the different directions. Um, we're not going to be doing an entire face, we're just going to be doing a part of the face, and I specifically chose a lower resolution image because I don't want us focusing too large on the details. So a lot of the times, let me just make this into its own layer. That didn't work. Background color. Yes, please. So anybody who's kind of looked through any face drawing books or tutorials, you'll see how everyone uses your draw three circles is usually one of the standard ones. But that's not the actual anatomy of the nose. Those are what we were using before called the drawing shapes. Oh, Twitch just decided to let you know I was streaming. Yeah, it does that. Sometimes a little bit behind. But those three circles, the triangle, those aren't the only shapes we can use. You can use whichever shapes work best for you. And you can look at other artists and see how they do that. I've seen some people who do a triangle and then they do a circle, just kind of at the very tip of the nose. Oh, and look at me drawing on the wrong layer, because of course, that's what I do. Oh, that's as far back as I can go. Okay. I wanted to give you a turntable just so you could kind of get a feeling for what the 3D object in question looks like. And because of COVID, after you wash your hands, feel free to touch your own nose, kind of see if there's bumps. Take a picture. I know I have a very distinct division between, there's two pieces of cartilage. Let me do this. The actual anatomy of a nose. There's two pieces of cartilage right here. I have a very distinct division between those two. You can't see it, but I can definitely feel it. So that changes how the lighting on my particular nose goes. It makes it quite a bit sharper. But we're going to break this down by stacking our shapes that we were looking at. And I'm going to be using our 3/4 view. And we can go with the standard, how people are normally taught. Your circles, your triangle. We'll do it here. How far up did I go with that triangle? We'll do it to about the bridge. So I'm just kind of drawing this on here so that way um, when we take it over here, we can kind of see where each of those shapes are in relation to which viewpoint we're looking at. And then there's also, I can't remember the technical name for it, the part that goes to your lip. So just me looking at that, that's kind of the shapes I'm seeing. Oh, and that, forgot when I'd change over, my brush would be really small. Then it got too big. I said I was going to use a 3/4 one. There we go. So if I'm looking at my shapes, I can see that nostril there. So I've used a couple circles. You can use a triangle if you want. Doesn't always have to be circles. Anime, you'll see that a lot. Actually, just going to turn that off for a second. Oh, how big am I drawing this? Apparently very large. That's okay. We'll just move you here. I'm kind of cutting my screen a little bit short here. Let me make it smaller. Better focus. Another way we can look at it is we can start breaking down our shapes via shadows and via color difference. So most people who've seen my way of styling stuff, they see me draw noses like this because I'm looking at this part. I don't know how well you can see my mouse. Hopefully you can see it well enough. I'm looking at this shadow that's on the underside of the nose. And you can see it here too, where it could, yes, I'm aware, thank you. I'm looking at this shape here, the shadow that the nose itself casts. And this shape here. And when you look at it on the side, that would be this shape. So for me, that's one of the shapes that I see very quickly right off the bat, just from the shadows. You can see it a little bit. Oh, oh, we're buffering. Let me check my connection. Okay, 1 second. Let me drop off some of my, might be because I've got some of my devices on our 5G. See if that, hmm, all right, 1 second. Let me try to restart. That was a strange, There we go. It seems to be going back up. Okay, if you try to refresh, that should have cleared it. You have a picture again, yay! Okay, sorry about that. So I'm not sure how far back it was before it cut out. So when I do my noses, I'm actually looking at my shadow shapes. His foot, there we go. So especially on 3/4, I'm kind of looking for this bit instead of just doing using a circle as a gesture. So on this one, I'd curl it down a little bit more. Oh, okay, that's good that that smoothed out. That was a very odd hiccup. Um, when I'm going with the shadow, looking for shadows, I'm using a little bit more of the building shapes instead of the drawing shapes to kind of build my find what I'm looking for, find all my shapes. Okay, perfect. The lesson points are still there. And then again, I'm looking at the shadow portions on her nose. So I'd have a bigger shadow here. Perfect. That's good. Yeah, my computer I saw bumped me off of the 5G. So just by using the shadows, you can start to find your shapes just as easily as if you do your circles. Oh, that is really big. Let's shrink that. And we can start hunting down shadows on the other view too, if we want to do that one. I think my pen's a little bit too small, so I'm just going to make that bigger. Ooh, that's too big. Look at me go. And then if you have a gum eraser, works really good for just lightly erasing lines. Just because I had kind of picked a blurry image, this line almost looks like it could be square. So we could square it out. Or we could go back to our circles. So if we know there's 1, 2, 3. This one doesn't look quite right. Should be a little bit longer. So even if you use different shapes, you'll probably end up at the same spot. But once you start figuring out what shapes you're personally more comfortable with, those will be the ones that you can then start transferring over to when you're drawing pretty much anything else. You're drawing your own character, fan art, bump over here. Oh, I've got 2 layers going. Whoops. There we go. And then when we had our, which layer was that? This one? When we had our circles, we could see where the nostril was lined up to in those, in the reference image, vaguely because I picked such a small. I see my thing keeps flickering to welcome to the chat room, so I'm keeping an eye on it. And then same thing for when we were trying to find the shapes of the shadows. I'm just going to add a little bit of hash marks so I can kind of keep track of those shadows. And then my shadow line here is giving me a little bit of lead down to the lip. As we go through and refine our shapes. So whenever you see in those drawing books or in tutorials where it's telling you you specifically have to use this shape, you don't have to. You can go through, see which ones work. You can try it with triangles if you want. So those are just with drawing shapes. With actual anatomy shapes, um, we've got that bump between the nose. Most people who know anatomy or who know a few things about noses know that the actual bone itself ends closer to here, and then there's that piece of cartilage. Or all this is cartilage, and there's that bone. I'm not the greatest at anatomy, if you couldn't tell. But we're breaking this down to smaller shapes if we want to shade it a little bit. So I can see little bumps there. And then the bridge of the nose, I was using just a rectangle to get that. And you can find your shapes of highlights. And feel free to let me know if you have any questions as we're going. And I'm not doing my normal shading using my solid gray scale brushes. I'm kind of trying to mimic. Uh, I know some of you guys are working with pencils, so I'm kind of trying to mimic that a little bit better. Your lines would probably be lighter and then slowly working up darker. So, and it's kind of hard to see, but I'm seeing a little bit of light there. And when you look at it, um, the nostril is putting a shadow on the face as opposed to this just a dark line. So we can kind of make that a little bit more obvious. And then this one I'm going to do in my grayscale kind of shading. We can go with uh, finding the shapes of our solid colors. I'm translating it to a kind of grayscale in my head as I'm going. But if you have a reference image and you want to just bump it over to grayscale and try to match that, feel free to do that. And as I had seen before, it was more of a shadow on the face than it was. And I apologize for not talking quite as much as I normally do. Um, but yeah, no, experiment with finding your finding your colors off your reference and making shapes off of that. So I can see my that highlight here. There, and doesn't seem to go all the way to the end. You're wanting to cry because you're finally figuring out how to draw noses. Yeah, no, it's all about looking at finding which shapes make the most sense to you. And then studying anatomy does help specifically for this, how things are going along underneath it. But it's good to keep aware uh, other people might be using other things that don't necessarily work for you. So try things out until you find what does work. I'm actually going to make this area a little bit grayer because I'm looking at it and it looks like it's, or a little bit darker, I should say. So finding shapes based on your shadows. Then it looks like that portion, I'm not going to go too far, but I can see when you see a lot of people who do the corner of the nose is straight down from the eye. In this case, yes. So I would darken out. Yeah, I would start getting in there, which I'm not. That's not my focus right now, so I'm not going to go too far into that. But I'm just finding where what lines up with what. And we'll go into relative spacing in a second. And I'm seeing these zigzag shapes that are almost like this, kind of coming up in there. So I'm using those to make it. And then the nice thing about turnarounds is I can look at it from this side and go, okay, where are those zigzag shapes appearing here? And in this case, I need to make that smaller. In this case, they're kind of appearing here, so that must be the under the eye shadows. Now this specific image that I picked for us today was I looked at it and I made sure it had good lighting. A lot of references that you might use, especially if they're from a photographer. Well, a photographer has access to all sorts of different lighting techniques and using multiple angles of lighting. Uh, so if you see some weird lighting that doesn't fit into some of your other drawings, if you're trying to transfer your reference over, could be because of that. And we'll go over later on today how to kind of look for directional lighting versus ambient lighting. So now that we're kind of getting the hang of stacking our shapes, stacking our circle and our rectangle, or finding our uh, what I call my nose shape, because I specifically use this one for noses. It's like a very weird diamond shape with one corner pulled in. Now that we're starting to figure out how to find shapes in our shading and stack our shapes, we're going to go on to the one that everyone always dreads, and we're going to start looking at hands. So that's the second resource image that I had thrown in there. And I'm just trying to decide which one we're going to do. Yes, Chell. There's hands involved. Okay, actually, I think we're going to do this top one here. Just save this one and start a new uh, blank canvas. Tried one earlier. Hands. I'm going to blow your mind a little bit on how to think of hands. Complex shapes. And let's start a new canvas. We'll make a new layer. Well, I will definitely look at it later. And anybody, whoever wants to send me stuff to look over, I can critique anybody's work. Feel free to email it to me on my website. So hands, like we were kind of doing last time, people like to overcomplicate hands. It's one thing I'm going to say. Because they are very complex and they emote a lot and they give away a lot of information about what's going on in a scene or how a character's feeling. You get your closed fists. Um, so people immediately overcomplicate it. They think it's a little bit more difficult than it is, and they want to draw all the little details. Well, just like with what we were doing before, we're going to break it down to the biggest shapes, and then we'll go smaller. So one trick to do with hands, let me actually, eh, I will put this on its own layer, and then I will make a gray background so I can lower that. And again, low resolution image so that way you can't get too focused on the details if it's low resolution because you can only zoom in so far. So if we break down this particular hand into its most basic shapes, we're going to start with the biggest, which is the actual hand itself. I'm just going to use a circle. There's your biggest shape. Now your next biggest shape, a lot of people are going to assume it's fingers. You don't have to do fingers individually. When you get a lot of repeating objects, you can gesture them together. So you can go, okay, we're going to do that. And then because this one pinky finger is the one that sticks out, we'll just do that one. Then thumb is over the glass. So instead of doing hands like hands, because your brain is going to try to overcomplicate it, try doing it like mitts. Do it on this one too. That would be our standard palm shape. Then you can group all your fingers together. And if we turn off our background, you can still see what's going on. You can go, oh, okay, fingers, thumb, pinky, thumb. Here's the ends of my fingers. We'll do one more. Where's, that's a good one. So we've got our big palm shape. And then this one, I'd group all the fingers that are on the same side of the glass together. So let's go like this. And I'm just connecting the points of them. And the thumb. And that's still fairly readable. If we want, we can break it down a little bit further. Where is all of our, uh, this third knuckle here? Well, it's here, here, and here. So we can see what's going on. And without even turning that on, I can start going, okay, fingers. And I'm just using squares. If I turn it on, oh, it was pretty close. Just because I could see where my knuckles were going. Let's take this top one here that we had started doing, and let's do that over here. So we've got our palm. I need to make my brush way bigger. 1 second. And I'm using a circle. I know some people prefer to use like a hexagon or a pentagon, pentagon, where they'll separate the index finger and then all of these fingers. I have kind of a square palm. My fingers. I don't necessarily have that edge between my index finger and the other fingers, but if that works for you, feel free. Uh, yeah. Do, 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 do. So my first biggest object is that palm. My next biggest object, and this was the part we didn't sketch out really, is going to be this glass. And I'm just going to use some of the simple shapes we had broken objects down to last time. A little bit of a circle going on there. Going down almost into another circle. And then the stem, I'm just using lines. I can't see past that edge, so I'm going to stop it there, but you can look in the other reference images, kind of see how that goes. And while we're working on this, one thing that's going to come up is something called relative sizing. So we don't know how big this hand is or how big this glass is, and we don't particularly need to. All we need to know is how big that hand is in relation to that glass. And that's where you'll see a lot of artists. If you ever see in movies, an artist is holding a pencil up to an object, and then they take it back to their picture. That's what they're doing. They're kind of finding a relative to things, uh, one object, and seeing if they can find something that is the same size. So that way, when they sketch it, they know to use the second object as that size. And I probably described that terribly because my brain is going all sorts of places. So I can go, okay, this wine glass is that long. And if I were to take my pen and look at it, well, that's that wine glass from there to there is longer than the palm by a little bit. So if I were to go like this, and for digital art, I can cheat a little bit, make a selection, duplicate it, and then just arrange it. But looking at it, I have my relative size going fairly well right now. I can actually, let me make that a different color for you. Mind the green. So you can see my circle is about the same relative size as that. So that means I'm going in the right direction, which is perfect. Because sometimes I don't, and sometimes it takes a couple tries. So my palm's about right. Oh, and I am using green, not black. Let's use black. I'm just going to find the outside of my thumb. Not going to bother finding the rest of it yet. So we had done one index finger, and then we had done all of the other fingers together. And I'm drawing this with rather thick lines for you. Normally I'd go a little bit thinner than this. And looking at this curve, I could probably do to bring it in a little bit more. And I can see that the palm comes down past the stem. But if I extend the palm a little bit, I have to make the glass bigger because of that relative sizing thing. I'm going to move it just a little bit so I can see where that wrist is going. So I can see that wrist kind of connects um, a little bit more off that flat circle that I had drawn. So I'm going to put it up here. And then I'm just erasing out my sketch a little bit. Now we could do what we did with the nose, and we could start finding shadows, or we can start finding something else called negative space. Negative space is the shapes that go around your focus object. So we can look and say, oh, hey, this negative space between the index finger and the thumb, it's fairly parallel the entire way down. Which I'm actually going to take that to mean that I don't quite have my index finger in the right spot. So I'm going to find my thumb circle. And looking at where the edge of the glass is, I think I have my thumb a little bit too high. So I'm going to drop that a little bit. And it's a little bit hard to see, but there's a bit of an overlap. And I'm not worrying about thumbnails, not worrying about the creases between the fingers, just finding my shapes. So looking at what this one circle would be compared to this one circle, this one would be quite a bit smaller. Maybe about that. Let's do that. We're going to try to move kind of quick so we don't focus too much on one thing. And I can see from my negative space shape, I don't quite have this in the right spot. And then we have our mitt, so we could start breaking our mitt down. And like before, I'm going to use kind of objects that are on top. Oh, did I actually poke around with? Oh, I don't think I did that one. I think that might have been a different lesson. When you've got things overlapping each other, sometimes it helps to do the objects that are closest to you and then start attaching them backwards. That's at least how I find it works. It works well for me, so I'm going to do my over top fingers, or the joint parts that are on top, and I'm just using kind of a J shape, because it looks like it's a little bit flat on the top of the fingers. J shape. I can see the shadow here, so I can find my shape through that shadow. I can already tell my shapes are a little bit big, but that's fine. We can tweak it as we go. And then finding where my joints are. Can use more J shapes. And I'm looking at this up here. If I were to do that holding up my pen trick, I'm gonna go crazy changing my brush size. I can look at this and see that it's definitely not, it gets narrower quite quickly, right about there, maybe. So I want to make sure that I keep this top lip fairly wide, and then having it get narrow, kind of in line with that pinky. That's where it's going to start getting narrow. I'm going to use a little bit of that zigzag just to kind of get that color idea in. And I'm just kind of using this negative shape. Let me get rid of that line. I'm just using that negative space between the fingers. Looks like it kind of comes down to a sharp point. And I can't really see what's going on, but I can put in my light reflection shape. So we can see where the lights are being reflected by the glass. You can kind of see where the finger starts coming up behind it. Looking at where my, and when you see me move my mouse over and I do this circle, I'm kind of pre-practicing my shape. And you can do that on, if you have a printed out reference image, you can do practice, and then when you bring it over, I'm working in a slightly different size, but I can still get the gist of my circle. And then what shapes could we see down here? It's a little bit harder to see with the shadow. Um, but there's that, the meat of your palm. So we can, let me make a new one. So you can kind of see the meat of your palm, and you can kind of see this square that goes down from the pinky to the wrist are the shapes that I feel like using on this one because I can kind of see that with the shadow. Got that right there. This looks like a triangle to me. I'm going to find that triangle. And I feel like that's a little bit high, so we'll go down here. And then I'm just going to fade that out right away since I have that glass drawn pretty good. And I have my circle not quite going in the right direction by the looks of things because this triangle carries down into there. I'm actually just going to grab that and move it. There's quite a bit of space between those two shapes. A little bit easier in digital. And if you find you're doing traditional and your paper isn't quite um, is starting to not quite survive your sketches, feel free to start a new one. Uh, draw your shapes a little bit darker, and then lay your paper over top of it, or your new paper, I should say. Or even try right from scratch. I'm looking at where that connects. And then I'm going to do a little bit more, an inking layer, we'll call it. So now that I've kind of got my shapes going on, I can see what's going where. That's where we can start getting a little bit more exact with our lines. And I'm using a little bit of a big brush for this, but Then I see this big highlight, so we can throw that in there. We can even do and this darker area that I'm kind of doing in the back of the glass, that's the glass is actually has some thickness to it. It's not just a paper thin object. So there is actually a little bit of shadow where you can see the inside of it. I'm just kind of trying to, come on, Photoshop, work with me. I'm just kind of trying to hint at the fact that the glass itself has mass. My lines are a little bit thick for that, but the idea is there. And if you find you have, like you can see, I have a little bit of an issue with this particular curve here, turn your paper around. So just from spinning my paper, that already looks a little bit, quite a bit better. And you might notice that the hand doesn't quite line up to the finger. That is a little bit of image refraction because of the way the glass curves. Fancy name for that would be the Fresnel effect for anyone interested in that. And then it looks like the top of this finger is a little bit, uh, or the nail is pointing in this direction, so you can even flatten that off. That helps you remember what's going where. And I can see a shadow right here, so I'm just going to throw that in. And there's the glass is, see, I can't tell if that's the glass or fingers. I think it might be the fingers casting a shadow. I'm drawing fairly heavy-handed today. Normally I'm a little bit looser, but that's okay. It's practice. I'm just going to fade out my shading since I am kind of heavy-handed today. And then because we're getting some glass refraction, It's actually hard to tell which is what finger, so we can kind of leave that a little bit vague. And I'd actually say I should probably get that finger just a little bit longer, so we'll do it a little bit longer. And then after this, we're going to take a little bit of a break, and then we're going to do the same thing but on landscapes. And you can see I'm kind of just doing the J shapes for where those fingers overlap. I'm not worrying too much about foreshortening or anatomy right now. I'm just trying to draw what I see from reference. Learning anatomy, if you're doing hands and characters and feet, is definitely something you should learn, but finding out what your shapes are can sometimes help you out to begin with, so you're not overcomplicating it in your head. Actually going to say my square line is probably more down here. And you can see the dark line where the light is hitting the glass, and it casts a shadow where it's thicker as opposed to where it's just one sheet of glass over top of another sheet of glass where it turns. So we can hint at that a little bit, just with a little bit of faded shadow. And I'm going to take that white again. And then we can kind of see where the light is hitting the top of this glass, and it's kind of reflecting a little bit down here. So if I turn off my lines underneath that, yeah, that looks like a hand that stands out as a hand. Kind of seeing the lines for the fingers. And then that would be where studying anatomy would come in handy, because then I can tell where my fingers are, where what finger is bending and connecting where. Although now I'm looking at my glass and my fingers, and they look a little bit, fingers look a little bit big, which means I probably went off from my relative size, and I can kind of cheat and do this again. So before we had said that the glass is slightly longer than the palm. Oh, not bad. And I can go back to my reference and look. So it kind of went to about the finger there. Yep, actually, I'm must just be going crazy. So we've got pretty solid. It's not perfect. We could spend quite a bit more time getting that more in line various other places. We could spend more time with finding our shadow shapes and throwing those in there. We could go in hardcore with our grayscale and find the exact shading. We could go in with color and even paint it. But that is how you find your shapes through various. Instead of thinking of your fingers as separate things, think of them as all in one and find your mitts. You can do the same thing with feet. You can find your sock shape before you find your toe shape. Break down from your largest to your smallest. And do we got any questions so far? None so far? Okay, well, we're going to take a 10-minute break and then we're going to do the same idea, but we're going to do it on uh use breaking down a bunch of objects into one larger shape for backgrounds. And we're going to find midgrounds, foregrounds, and the backgrounds of a landscape. So take a 10-minute break, get some water, let your eyes reset, and we will be right back. Okay, and I am back, and we're going to throw it on. Oh, once I can find it. Actually, let's put you up here, because you're. We can move all of these over here. Come on, pointer. There we go. Okay, so now that we've got kind of combining a bunch of objects, we're going to do the same thing with a landscape. Oops, didn't mean to close all of them. That's okay. Now I have to restart it. Oh, come on. Where are you, you little arrow? That's not the right one. I am not going to save that. I just want my little. There we go. Got it. Nailed it. So we can use all of the same, I'm just going to drop this a little bit. We can use all of the same techniques we've been using, and we can do that with backgrounds. So we're going to start finding our shapes. Um, you can work either from, again, the shapes closest to the shapes farthest, or you can start working from the general background shape, work your way forward. One of the reasons why I picked our beautiful Vancouver here is because there's a fairly flat plane. There is a point where the horizon meets. We're not going to get too much into perspective. That's I can spend 4 or 5 classes teaching first, second, or 1 point, 2 point, and 3 point perspective. So for now, we're just going to learn how to do backgrounds with shapes. So right off the bat, I can see our mountains in the background, and we've got a bunch of buildings in the front. And I can, if I draw a line, I can see my buildings are all, for the most part, perfectly straight up and down. And I'm going to use a little bit of color on this one to find what I'm looking for. So we're going to do our white buildings as our foreground, and I can kind of see I'm just getting a general shape. And I'm being very loose, kind of finding where these buildings are, but I'm not being very specific about their shape. So that one's kind of that guy there. And like the fingers, I'm combining a bunch of shapes into one. And I could probably move that a little bit closer. Maybe drop that down a little bit more if I'm looking here. That's about the same height. And get that brown building. And I'm looking for that division between that the negative space. We're going to call all of the clouds and the sky and the mountains. Right now, that is going to be our negative space. So then if I come over here, there's another building, a little bit shorter. And I'm seeing my thing is hiccuping, so let me know if my stream starts lagging, and I'll give my internet a kick again. So I can see that one's overlapping that one. So I'll make it overlap. I can kind of see that angle roof. I'm getting a little bit more specific with my shapes as I get closer in. But still, I'm trying to work big, work large, before I get into any ideas of details. So looking at this, We could always break out our relative sizing like we did with the glass and the hands. I'm just going to be very, so if that one was that one, and it's definitely not straight, it's more of this, I don't have a new layer on there. There we go. I'm looking at this right here, so I can practice it a few times. That's still not quite sharp enough. Let's go. There we go. That looks a little bit better. And when I did this line, that's when I could start noticing, oh, hey, there's a couple things that connect there. So I can bring this one in there, and it kind of starts going behind the other one. There's that little causeway or park area. And I can see that there's a gap between the buildings. I'm just trying to kind of work in mostly straight up and down. Ooh, that was not the right tool. So now that we're starting to look at, hey, I can see a street in between them, and I start having to separate buildings. That's how I'm going to be able to tell what is more my foreground than my background, because these ones you can't really see any spaces between them, other than the occasional dips between our shapes here. It looks like there's a little bit one there. And I'm just looking at this line, so then I'm making it a little bit jagged to kind of look like the tops of buildings. And then if I look from the edge of this causeway and go straight up, it's kind of where I want to end that. I'm not making it perfect because chances are I haven't drawn this at the right size yet. But on that line there, actually, since we had it, you can see that we've got this bit that sticks out on the water. It seems to almost just go straight back along the edges. And I'm just going to use lines just to kind of show the windows there. Then we can kind of make it a little bit jagged. Do stairs. Stairs are a good shape, especially for buildings. And then as you can see, I'm starting to get more specific shapes into my foreground. And this is just a sketch. I'm not doing a landscape painting, just learning shapes, right? and I can see that there's some concrete piles going into the water there, but I'm not going to get very specific. I'm just going to draw concrete piles. And then if I look at this sizing, that line looks a lot shorter than this line. So I'm going to make that a lot narrower. And I can see we've got some trees in the foreground. Some people prefer to work more on the background. I'm not going to get too specific other than that I might erase. You can use your eraser to find shapes too. You can see there's a little bit of building. Just draw hints of lines, or it might be a rooftop. Vancouver is notorious for their roof grass. And again, I'm not worrying too much about that concept of perspective right now. That could be, if I wanted to paint this, that would be something I'd do separate. Right now, I just want to get a general idea of what's going on where. I could see some trees on the top of that too, some bushes. So we could just use squiggle lines, that squiggle line drawing shape. Excuse me. And you can see I'm not really putting in boats or anything like that right now. And I can kind of see like this string of balconies maybe. So I'm just gonna throw working loose, working quick. And I can kind of see where that peninsula is sticking out a little bit. So I'm just going to kind of vaguely throw that in there. And I'm not going to do the whole thing, um, but we can definitely start putting in that bridge. That's a big focal point. And I can see this shape up here. And we could put a couple of uh, vague shapes that we haven't seen anywhere else just to kind of add a little bit of difference and remind ourselves if we were to go take this to a painting, hey, this is what this is. And with buildings, you can see I'm using a lot of straight lines. And then when I move to the bushes and the trees, I use a little bit more of an organic movement. And that's kind of an illusion trick to making people think, oh, okay, that's a bush. Or at least for me, that's my shorthand for organic versus things made mechanically. And some people use circles, and some people for trees. Periodically, I'll do this for trees too. You can just use back and forth, especially for these pines. You just use back and forth zigzags, coming into a point, and then do your next layer, and just work back and forth. When you get into the more leafy ones, you can just squiggle if that's how you're seeing the shapes. And then for me, it helps me to work in blocks of color a little bit more than it does just to work in straight lines. So I'm actually just going to fill this in. And you can do this right from the get-go. If it works better for you, just work straight in blocks of shape or blocks of color. So I'm just doing this. This is what I'm considering my mid-ground. I can't see exact details. I can't see areas between the streets. Buildings are overlapping so much, they might as well all be one giant building. See, there's looks like a little bit of a sand beach. I'm going to call that one mid-ground. I'm going to take another color. This one's going to be my foreground. So already if I were to zoom out, we can look at that and go, oh, that looks starting to look like a town, starting to look like a city. And we're not even doing much other than just making shapes. So now we've kind of got an idea of our foreground, an idea of our midground. We can hit our background. And we could see that this mountain comes all the way up to, we had used this one. Again, we're not getting exact on mountain shapes, but we're just finding where the mountains meet the sky. I'm I personally see a lot of curves, a lot of jagged triangles, so I'm kind of just trying to draw in those jagged triangles, and I'm getting lighter as I go farther back. Uh, that's me. Some people just do all in one, but the lighter lines, there's something called a depth of field, and depth of field is where things that are close or within your field of focus are clear, and then everything else is hazy. So in this case, the depth of field is these boats, these buildings, and then out of the depth of field is all this stuff in the background. That's why it's a little bit hazier. You can't see quite as much details. And then I can't really see it too much, but there is a horizon line there somewhere. And I want slightly darker. We're going to name this one background. And if it helps you to use an opposite color scheme, do your doing your foreground shapes in a darker color and then your background shapes in a lighter color, you can do that too. There's no right or wrong way to find your shapes. And then because just from looking at it, you can go, oh, okay, this almost looks like it's attached. So I'm actually just going to bring that background and bring it in. And if you want, you can start making your lines a little bit bolder. Actually, I don't think I'm gonna go that route. I'm just scribbling. In the words of Bob Ross, happy little buildings, happy little trees. So we're starting to get our city of Vancouver. And even if we were to take off the lines, we could start to see, oh, hey, my shapes are coming in. And if we want to go a little bit more into it, we can go, okay, where's my heavy shadow shapes? I'm going to select this color, make it a little bit darker. Where's my heavy shadow shapes? Okay, well, we could start getting them in there. And again, I'm not working terribly exact. I also zoomed out, so now my eyes are going, wait, where the heck are all my shapes? And these ones I'm actually going to go the opposite way. I'm going to make them, I'm going to look at kind of my light areas. And I'm just using lines, squares. And these ones are kind of starting to get more into just vague up and down shapes. Though I can see some trees in there. So I'm going to kind of pick a mid-tone. Let me draw some squiggly trees in there. They seem to be acting as a divider. And I can't quite see the exact details, so I'm going to just guesstimate a couple lines. The little shorthands that you make yourself for, oh, okay, there's a wire bridge or something going on there. So without knowing anything about, or without using any perspective, because if I was going to use perspective, I would have drawn in an actual grid. Even just looking for shapes, you can use it in any which way you want, and it's useful for everything. Look for shapes everywhere. If it gets frustrating, just break it down more and more and more. Gonna save that. Any questions so far? No questions? Okay, and then the last one I think we're going to hit, I think I'm going to move directional lighting to next week, is just ambient lighting. And I think I want, I've got it somewhere on my desktop, the shapes we were using last time. No, I'll just draw them from scratch. That's obviously not working the way I want it to. So I'm just going to draw a kind of loose circle. We'll do a circle. Um, hmm, what other one was a good one? We'll do a stair. So we're stacking a bunch of squares. That's what we're going to do. Then we're just going to put a couple parallel lines. My stairs aren't very even. I'm obviously not a carpenter. And let's do a round one that's got round and flat edges. So we'll do our cylinder again. So ambient, the best way to oh, excuse me, to describe ambient lighting is uh, imagine a room with a lot of windows at about lunchtime. You never really have to turn on any lights. There's light everywhere. Everything is well lit. It's easy to see. There's no real shadows being cast anywhere. That's kind of what ambient light is. So there's enough light bouncing around the room that the object is in. You won't see cast shadows. You won't see, uh, you don't usually see it cast a shadow on itself. And you see that kind of effect a lot with photographers when they're taking pictures of certain people. If they don't want extreme lighting, they light everything from multiple sides. You'll see those like umbrella light reflectors, specifically to reflect light everywhere. Uh, but in art and drawing especially, it's kind of hard to have this object, this circle, and go, oh yeah, no, that's a sphere, that's a basketball. So we kind of have to do a little bit of cheating in order to make it readable as a 3D object. And when you have no lighting information, um, we're going to be depending a lot on optical illusions and such as line thickness. So I can say, okay, if this object is going to be on the ground, I'm going to make the bottom a little bit thicker. And then even if there's no directional light, I'm going to say the part that's closest to us is going to be the part that we can see a little bit easier and has the most light. So we're going to start shading out the back. We'll start shading that kind of in towards the middle. And I'm not putting in an actual lighting direction, but I'm saying if this is our middle part, halfway down, this thing is going to start casting a shadow on itself in a circular pattern, kind of like a smaller sphere. So this is how we start tricking people into saying, okay, this object is 3D, even if there's no lighting information. Um, for a cylinder, we can use lines to indicate which way the cylinder is curving, kind of like we did with the can, and we're going to go from the edges and go in, and that's going to give that optical illusion of depth. And these are tricks you'll find that you end up using even in, oh, and I rotated this a little bit. Even when you do put directional lighting in, you might still make the edges darker. And then if we said later on, oh, the light's coming from the back, I would still have these darker, and then we'll really blind out just the edges. Square shapes, we start getting a little bit, um, we start using a little bit more of where things crease together. So at a 90-degree angle, we'd say, hey, even though the room is full of light, this part right here isn't actually getting as much light as the flat surface. And say this stair is against a wall. So, oh, okay. We want just the line itself darker, and then we can just barely shade out. Ooh, no, the text tool, not the text tool. There we go. Wrong tool. I love that rotate is right next to text tool. It makes my life very easy. So these areas where the light isn't quite bouncing into, we're faking that darker, even if we have no lighting information. And that starts to look a little bit more realistic, like that looks like the inner corner. And then we're going to do the exact opposite on outer corners. Outer corners, we're going to pretend catch the most light by making my lines pretty much as thin as possible. And if I were shading a little bit more, I can go like this and still say that there's no real lighting. I would keep my outer edge as faded out as possible. And we could say that the same thing for this cylinder. So we can go, oh, okay, this outer edge is catching the most amount of light. This part's rounded, so it continues on with itself even though where it looks flat. But right here where we're going to say, hey, this is sitting on something, sitting on a desk or a table, we're going to make that line quite a bit more bold, almost like a fake shadow. And this is kind of how we start faking objects, or faking 3D with ambient light. And then when you go in later and add your directional shading, that is going to, if you keep those and just keep adding directional shading on top of it, makes your objects look more realistic, more 3D. We'll say this, we'll pretend this stair has a lip on it. Then you always just kind of always guesstimate a cast shadow on things that are overlapping. That one would be our exposed edge. Or our beyond 90-degree edge. And then as we get bends that get closer together, so we're going to get our stair and it's going to start looking really funny here in a second. Eh, yeah, okay. So once we start getting really objects really close together, it's going to get quite a bit more darker the closer that angle is. And that's how we're going to fake give the optical illusion that even without lighting, that's how we're going to fake making things 3D. Here we go. And then same thing with this angle. The sharper it gets, the more light it'll catch. Kind of like the edge of a sword. A sword isn't paper thin, but when you can see just the edge of it, you generally see that almost just straight line of highlight because that sharp point is catching all the light. Yeah, and we will do directional lighting next week. I'm gonna bump it to next week. But that is your basics on ambient lighting. Do we got any questions so far? Or did I explain that terribly? Sweet. Okay. I actually didn't pre-plan homework because that's just me. Uh, but I'm going to say because last week we did um, making shapes out of or making objects out of shapes, simple objects. So we're gonna do uh, let's do one complex object. So that can be a face or a vehicle or heck, you can do the back of your TV. One complex object, find your shapes, and then see if you can get a reference image and find your shapes with or find your shadow shapes. That one. And if you need help with any of them, feel free to shoot me a message. uh, or if you're not sure about your reference, if it's too complex or too the lighting seems a little bit off, and I could probably talk to you a little bit about directional directional lighting before we get to next week. But yeah, see if you can find the shapes that the shadows make or the colors and pick a portrait, pick landscape. Doesn't have to look exactly like your reference. Right now we're just practicing shapes. And if there's no questions, I will see you guys all next week.